crisis, or fairly or unfairly. It's often joked about in films and TV, but according to recent studies, 38% of people in their mid-20s and early 30s are experiencing what themselves are calling a midlife crisis. But how can this be? And what does it mean? Well, joining me now to talk us through it is behavioural psychologist Padraig Walsh. How are you?
I'm good, Emma. How are you doing?
Good. I'm not going to lie, this is kind of terrifying.
Really?
Midlife crisis, I always just assumed was something that kind of happened, you know, a little bit later in life. But before we get into the idea of an early midlife crisis, what are your thoughts on the traditional stereotype, you know, of the fella in his 50s ditching the family, buying the red sports car? Like, is that just a myth or is that an actual thing?
Do you know, James Bond and Thelma and Louise have so much to answer for, don't they?
Yeah.
Like that idea of just taking off in your sports car, that archetype, you know,
Yeah.
and it was so alluring, particularly in the 80s, you know, in the 70s and 80s, where people predominantly had their life course set out by their late 20s, you know, so this is why things like, you know, Thelma and Louise or that archetype of a midlife crisis was so interesting for film.
Yeah.
Now, I would say that actually that archetype isn't really backed up by research. Most people kind of go through a period of transition, but like, so it's more Hollywood than psychology, that big change that happens. And if you do, it gets made into a film. But what you have is people being really interested in this idea of throwing it all away. But in reality, what most of us tend to do is make those slight transitions as we go through life. But you'll notice that most of the time in the 70s and 80s, it was people leaving jobs they didn't like, or very boring circumstances, or people who had sleepwalked into a lifestyle that didn't work for them, and then suddenly changing it all.
So I think obviously, you know, I always feel as well, sometimes maybe now we've more choices as well, you know, so like back then they probably felt that they had to follow a certain route, whereas now people are there's a bit more freedom to kind of try different things.
There is, and that can be a blessing and a curse, you know. There's the whole concept we use in psychology of the paradox of choice. So if you go onto Netflix and you have no guiding light whatsoever, if there's no pathway led out, you're going to spend all your time scrolling through stuff without actually selecting a movie. So the idea of having too much choice can paralyze us when it comes to making a choice. So quite often it's nice to have some sort of guiding paths for us, you know, particularly as we go through life. You know, some rules of thumb that kind of make life a little bit simpler. But if we stay too close to those and we don't tune into, well, actually, what is it that I really want for myself? That's when it can get tricky and difficult. So we do have more choice now, but sometimes we have to be really conscious of how we navigate those choices.
So we're going to go back to 2025. So we talked about, you know, kind of back in the day, you know, the fellas ditching their jobs, their family, buying the red sports car. But for those who are younger, like, what thoughts and feelings might they be having if they're in the throes of an early midlife crisis?
So there's some really interesting research that's coming out about this idea of even a quarter life crisis. I've heard it referred to. People in their early mid-20s going, you know what? I have tried to follow the rules here. I have been told to study hard, work hard, you know, get a qualification and, you know, live my life by certain rules that were laid down to me. And now suddenly I have no stake in society. I'm not able to afford somewhere to live. I'm not even able to afford somewhere to rent. I'm left with really difficult choices here. You know, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there would have been difficulties getting a job and people would emigrate for that. Now we have almost full employment in Ireland, but very, very difficult. It's very, very difficult to get accommodation that's affordable. So you have this gap between what people are earning and what they can actually afford. Yeah. And this makes people go, well, what's this all about? And that's what a midlife crisis really is that point where you're going, well, I have to reevaluate things here. I need to make an adjustment. And if I don't have a stake in society, if I feel like the rules, the social contract has somewhat been broken, well, then we're going to have to really, you know, lean into this idea of change, or in some cases, they're calling it a crisis.
So you talked about there, like, you know, like housing and not being able to afford maybe to rent or to buy a house, and like you have your job, but like what other factors are causing people to experience what feels like the midlife crisis in their 20s and their 30s? I know,
take people in their 20s and 30s. I'm not in the 20s, not even in my 30s anymore, Emma. You know, just barely not. Okay, yeah. But what we have are people who grew up. Let's say you were 25 now. Okay, you were 10 years of age. You know, CMAT has her song at the moment now, and she's her new song.
Euro Country, yeah.
Yeah, so she's talking about her experience as somebody from Gen Z reflecting on the financial crisis.
Yeah.
And a lot of the narrative was, this bypass to the really young generations. She's saying absolutely not. We were surrounded by this worry, by this angst, if it was from our parents, and we weren't really sure what was happening. You move forward from that, and suddenly we're into the likes of COVID. You start looking at cost of living and the housing crisis, and all of these things have barreled through and bridge that all together in the creation and the kind of wild west of social media, coming on stream in 2008, 2009, and it just has really emphasized any angst, any kind of worries that somebody would have had. We're in like the turbocharged comparison era, and that can be really difficult if you're trying to navigate your 20s and figure out what am I doing, and suddenly you're seeing somebody else getting on in life. That can amplify those feelings of inadequacy.
And that was something that I wanted to talk about, because obviously social media plays a huge part, and you said there about comparison, and comparison is the thief of joy, as people say. And sometimes what you're seeing on social media isn't necessarily what's really happening in people's lives, because people like to show kind of the good things in their lives rather than the bad things. So you can understand how that might then play into kind of amping up these feelings for people.
It's never the case that what we post on social media is the pure, unfiltered experiences that we have. And that can really, if you're, I suppose, comparing yourself to other folks, and you're saying, well, there should be some sort of life plan. There should be some sort of template that I should be following. And I'm not hitting those benchmarks because I'm comparing myself to other people. Our immediate feeling is that of inadequacy, is that feeling that I'm not good enough or I'm not worth it. But actually, we all have our own path to beat. I often say to folks that I work with, people that I know, is that you get one shot at this life.
Yeah.
One shot, and it's your life, and it's nobody else's. It is your own path to beat. And like you said earlier on, we have our own control over what we would like to do. And that becomes really important. It's not to march to the beat of somebody else's drum. It's to make sure that you're living to your own values. And I think that's what a period of reflection or evaluation, or in some cases you might call it a crisis, but I think it's more of a re-evaluation to go, well, what's important to me? And am I living by those? But the noise of social media can make that conversation with yourself really hard.
And I think that's the thing, people might call it a crisis, but actually I think it's very brave if somebody gets to a certain point in life and, you're not happy with your current circumstances and you decide, I'm just going to change everything. I'm going to go in this direction instead of that direction. I think that takes huge courage for somebody to do that.
It really does. And how we label things is important. Like I was coming in here today and my wife was in the car, and I said, look, I'm trying to talk about like framing. And if somebody tells you you're tired, you suddenly feel more tired than you were before. And I was like, is there a way that you can frame it? And she goes, well, I remember giving childbirth, right? And she said there was the term contractions, right? When somebody experiences a contraction. Now, Emma, I'm not going to mansplain childbirth to you, okay?
I haven't given birth yet, but I have a fair idea of what's to come.
Neither have I, right? This is how she explained it, that there's a term that they use called contractions, right? And that tenses you up. And the idea is to use a word to help you to relax. So she said, I found it really helpful when people called it a surge rather than a contraction. And it helped me to reframe what was going on. So if you can imagine that you're making a couple of changes in your life, you make a career change, or you break up from a relationship, or you move house or move abroad, and you get a new hairstyle. Suddenly somebody turns to you and says, you know what, you're going through a midlife crisis. Suddenly you start to go, am I going through a crisis? Is this the narrative that I'm creating in my own head? So the way that we frame things, the words that are used to describe these changes becomes really important. Because if I say, actually, no, this is not a crisis. This is me having a re-evaluation, a readjustment, or I'm just, reflecting on where things are at. And you know what? I like having pink hair, so I'm going to have pink hair. Or I always wanted to, try out this new career, so I'm going to do that. That's okay, as long as you're sure that it's on your own terms. That it's not to kind of fight against something else, or that you're suddenly feeling like you're going into a meltdown because other people say you're having a crisis.
But how do you, if you think you are going through, say, like a crisis, okay, so it is, I do think that, obviously, like your thoughts, you're like, it is a thought thing, you can change your thoughts and make it not a crisis. But how do we know what's the difference between a crisis, okay, I say crisis, and just normal feelings of young adulthood?
It's a really good question. And I suppose you're taking your data, I would say your data, like you take your evidence from other people and you go, okay, well, how do I feel in all of this? Am I comfortable in making these changes? Am I feeling grounded? Like I use that term grounded a lot, for ourselves, that somebody can live a life of their choosing where they have lots of different careers, live in lots of different places, have lots of different relationships, but they're fully grounded with that, that they feel okay. And then we talked earlier on about the archetype where they felt like they had to have particular points in their life that, have a job at a certain stage, have it pensionable, have X, Y, and Z markers in my life, and suddenly throw it all away. And it's about feeling grounded in yourself and how do you feel? So that idea of checking in on yourself and reflecting and going, okay, Am I doing okay here? So crisis is only a crisis if you label it one.
Yeah, if you let it be one for you.
If you let it be one for yourself. That, there is no rules to life that say you have to have a relationship, a career, or any of these other arbitrary markers in our life at a particular age. It's actually, you said earlier on, we have lots of control. We have much more control than we had before, and we can make choices with that. Now, money gives us those choices. That's what money is, really. It is that opportunity to give yourself security or choice. And if you're finding, like we said earlier on, that the cost of things versus the salary that you have is, like it is at the moment in that cost of living crisis, that can limit your choices or your sense of control and your feeling of having a stake in society. That's where the difficulty can land in, and where it can feel a little bit overwhelming or feel like, tending towards a crisis.
Do you think as well for young people, when you're leaving school and you kind of have this big decision to make, you've got your CAO and you decide what you want to do for the rest of your life before you're 18, and a lot of people don't really know at that point what it is that they want to do in life. So do you think that kind of contributes to it, where people kind of leave school, they go into college, they just say to study accountancy or whatever it might be, without actually really thinking about what they really want to do with their lives, and then when it comes to their late 20s, they're like, what am I doing with my life?
Exactly. Some of the most interesting people I know still don't know what they want to do with their lives, and they're into their 40s or 50s. But it's madness, really, isn't it, Emma? That at the age of 18, we're asking people to make huge life decisions around the career that they want. And there's a fantastic book that I'm reading at the moment called Range by a guy called David Epstein, and he talks about the value of, that those phrases that say never, ever, ever give up. I was telling you earlier on that I did a triathlon yesterday in Greystones.
Fair play to you.
And you know what, there was parts of it I enjoyed, but it was really well run. It was fantastic people. It was for a great cause. But the idea of saying never, ever, ever give up, you hear all of these phrases, right? Actually, the research will say, you know what? It's okay to give up on certain things that don't fit with what you want.
Yeah, if it doesn't serve you.
If it doesn't serve you, it's absolutely okay. And it's quite wise, in fact, to say, certain things don't work. Now, there's a sweet spot when it comes to giving up or changing. It's to take it past that point of discomfort. So if you're, I don't know, if you're starting a job or you're in a career or you're doing a course and you're going, I'm not so sure about this, okay? The key thing is to not run at the first sign of discomfort. Because if that happens, you'll never... Imagine you found the partner of your dreams and they really were top notch, but the first time they farted, you left. Like, that's not going to work. You're never going to be happy, okay? Because everyone does it. So it's about making sure...
Excuse me, ladies, don't.
But so the key thing is making sure that if you're thinking or considering about making a change, it's about taking it just that little bit beyond discomfort.
Yeah.
It has to go beyond discomfort for it to be really thoughtful and really meaningful. However, don't stay in it so long that it wears you down. So this idea of never, ever, ever give up. If you're 5 years down the line, you're going, I'm really not in a career that I enjoy here, and this is taking away from other aspects of my life, then you can't leave it that long for yourself. It's not a good decision-making process for you. But running at the first sign of discomfort, not so good either.
I just have one final question for you. So for somebody who's listening now, at what point would you say that someone may need to maybe reach out for some professional help?
Yeah. If you are noticing it taking away from other aspects of your life, if this is consuming you, and actually, you know what, you're noticing changes in yourself. So maybe you don't notice them yourself. That's one of the things about, things like crisis or burnout, is that quite often it's somebody else who knows you very well. And it's not just taking any random person saying this to you. It's somebody who knows you very well, who has got your best interests at heart, and they're noticing something in you, and they're saying maybe you need to, seek some help on this, or maybe it's something you're noticing yourself. It's taking away from other elements of your life, and it's taking away from who you are. Then that's the point where you start to look for help.
Brilliant. Padraig Walsh, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating stuff, and I think there's a lot there for people to probably think about. Very helpful. Thank you. That was behavioural psychologist Padraig Walsh. Back after this.